In the frigid winter of 1872, Boston's working-class neighborhoods were haunted by a chilling nightmare. 7 young boys aged 4 to 9 were found brutally beaten and tortured, their small bodies left as if discarded by something inhuman. But the real horror wasn't just in the savagery. It was in the growing realization that the perpetrator wasn't a shadowy figure of legend, but a 12-year-old boy. He had a milky white eye that made him unforgettable, and a disturbing cruelty that earned him the names the Boy Torturer and the Red Devil across New England. The Boston Globe described him as someone who seemed to derive twisted pleasure from pain, while police struggled to comprehend how a child could mastermind such horrific acts. This is the true story of Jesse Pomeroy, the youngest person in Massachusetts history convicted of first-degree murder in a case that shattered society's beliefs about childhood innocence, forcing the legal system to grapple with the unthinkable. Jesse's story began in Charlestown, Massachusetts, a bleak industrial district where the clang of the naval yard filled the air and poverty ruled everyday life. On November 29, 1859, Ruth Ann Snowman Pomeroy gave birth to her son Jesse beneath the dim flicker of gas lamps in a cramped tenement apartment. Her joy quickly turned to sorrow. The infant's right eye was clouded completely white by a rare defect called leukocoria, giving him a ghostly, unsettling stare. Jesse's father, Thomas, a battle-hardened Civil War veteran, felt only revulsion at the sight of his newborn son. Already hardened by life and laboring long hours at the naval yard, Thomas saw Jesse not as a child, but as a deformity, something shameful. From the start, Jesse received no warmth or affection. His father's resentment turned violent, and the boy became a constant target for his rage. As Jesse grew, the milky film in his eye became more prominent, deepening his alienation. Neighbors called him devil-touched. Mothers clutched their children when he walked by. At school, he was mocked and tormented relentlessly. Children jeered cruel nicknames like Marble Boy and Devil's Child, pelting him with rocks, spitting on him, and shunning him completely. Overburdened teachers paid him little attention, labeling him strange and unreachable. Utterly alone, Jesse sought solace in cheap dime novels, grim tales of frontier violence filled with torture and revenge. While other boys saw adventure, Jesse absorbed the gory details, like gospel studying every technique and scenario. But it wasn't just the outside world that shaped him. Within the Pomeroy home, his father's abuse took on a ritualistic cruelty. In a rotting woodshed behind the house, Jesse was stripped naked and whipped with belts or horsewhips until blood ran down his skin. The beatings were deliberate, calculated to maximize pain and humiliate him. His father lashed out, not just at his son's behavior, but at his very existence, calling him worthless, unlovable, and cursed. His older brother Charles, just over a year older, disowned him emotionally and physically. While Charles thrived socially, Jesse was the family disgrace. They shared a bedroom, but Charles often slept elsewhere to avoid his strange brother. In a world that treated him as a monster, Jesse found the only flicker of understanding from his mother, Ruth Ann, the lone source of comfort in a life otherwise defined by cruelty, isolation, and growing darkness. Even Ruth Ann's love, though genuine, was tragically misdirected. When neighbors began whispering about Jesse torturing and killing cats, throwing their mutilated bodies into the Mystic River, she refused to see the truth. To her, these were signs of a lonely boy crying for help, not the emerging profile of a future predator. After each of her husband's brutal beatings, she would gently clean Jesse's wounds, whispering that the world didn't understand him, that he was special, fueling a dangerous sense of victimhood while shielding him from consequences. When teachers expressed concern over his violent fixations and inability to connect with others, she dismissed them as unfairly biased because of his appearance. But by the time Jesse turned 12, something inside him had irreversibly changed. The years of pain, humiliation, and rejection had not broken him. They had twisted him into something cold, calculating, and deeply dangerous. Jesse didn't set his sights on the strong who had tormented him, but rather on those more vulnerable than himself. He studied younger children the way a predator studies prey, learning their habits, identifying their weaknesses, rehearsing smiles and soft-spoken promises like an actor preparing for a role. By the winter of 1871, whatever empathy he might have once had was gone. What remained was a boy shaped by cruelty, now determined to inflict it. On December 26, 1871, Boxing Day, while families in Chelsea gathered in post-holiday warmth, 4-year-old William Payne played alone outside his modest home. Jesse had been watching the boy for weeks. With pockets full of stolen penny candy and toys, he approached William with a gentle voice and a practiced smile, luring him with promises of fun and sweets. The child, innocent and trusting, took Jesse's hand and followed him through the streets to Powderhorn Hill, a remote, desolate place Jesse had chosen specifically for its isolation. At the top of the hill stood a crumbling outhouse, forgotten and surrounded by weeds and garbage, perfectly secluded. Inside that rotting structure, Jesse's facade dropped, and he ordered William to undress, tied his wrists with rope, and hoisted him from the ceiling beam like a piece of meat. In the frigid air, Jesse methodically beat the helpless child with his fists and a splintered piece of wood, pausing only to watch the terror rise in William's eyes. For Jesse, this was power. This was control. For the first time in his life, he was no longer the victim. But Jesse stopped short of murder. Whether out of fear or some final shred of restraint, he left William alive, naked, beaten, and freezing, suspended in the outhouse as night fell. The boy was discovered the next morning, barely alive, and the attack sent a wave of panic through the tight-knit community. But police, unable to comprehend the idea of a child committing such a calculated assault, looked only for adult suspects. And as they searched fruitlessly, Jesse evolved. Over the next few months, 3 more boys were lured to that same hill, each suffering similar fates: cold terror and violence. All described a brown-haired boy with a strange, disturbing look who had promised treats and games. Each attack grew more precise, more vicious. Jesse was experimenting, learning which methods caused the most fear and pain. He scoured the area for tools, metal scraps, broken boards, and forced his victims to strip in the freezing cold before unleashing beatings so brutal they left lifelong scars. The boy who had once been abused had now become something worse. A child predator, refining his techniques, feeding his hunger for dominance, and leaving behind a trail of broken innocence that Boston's authorities still couldn't understand. Jesse Pomeroy's descent into monstrous cruelty didn't stall with time, it intensified. No longer satisfied with beatings alone, he began incorporating pins and needles into his torture sessions, deliberately piercing the most sensitive parts of his victims' bodies while observing their reactions with a cold, almost scientific detachment. Even more disturbing, Jesse introduced sexual elements into his assaults, forcing acts upon his victims, while their blood stained his face, a ritual that granted him an intoxicating high of power and domination, unlike anything he had felt before. To ensure their silence, he threatened to murder their families, fixing them with his pale marble-like eye as he promised unspeakable consequences should they dare to speak the truth. The newspapers dubbed the mysterious figure the Boy Torturer, and the city of Chelsea posted a staggering $500 reward for information, an immense sum in an era when most families scraped by on a fraction of that amount. Fear gripped the community. Children were kept indoors after dark, and when errands were necessary, they traveled in groups under strict instructions to avoid all strangers. Then Jesse's father unknowingly pushed his son past the final threshold. On July 20th, 1872, just 2 days before Jesse would commit his most violent act, yet Thomas Pomeroy discovered troubling evidence of his son's behavior. Enraged, he dragged Jesse into the woodshed and delivered a ferocious beating, one far worse than anything, before screaming that he wished Jesse had never been born. Something shattered inside Jesse that night. Whatever restraint had held him back from killing was obliterated. Bleeding and broken on the floor, staring at his father's contorted face, Jesse made a silent, chilling decision. The next child he took would not be coming back. On July 22, 1872, 7-year-old Johnny Balk became Jesse's final victim in Chelsea. The torture was more sadistic than ever before, pushing past the limits of anything previously witnessed. Johnny survived, but just barely. The level of violence made it clear to investigators that their attacker had crossed into new psychological territory. At home, Ruth Ann Pomeroy had been reading the increasingly urgent newspaper coverage of the boy torturer. When the Boston Globe published a physical description, a larger boy with brown hair and a distinctive milky white eye, her blood ran cold. She recognized her son. But instead of turning Jesse in or seeking help, Ruth Ann chose denial. Whether out of shame, fear, or deluded maternal instinct, she refused to face the reality of what her child had become. She quietly arranged for the family to move across the Charles River to South Boston, hoping a fresh start would erase the darkness. She convinced herself Jesse's violence stemmed from years of bullying, that a new environment would heal him. She didn't grasp that Jesse was no longer simply a troubled child. He was a predator. By that time, Thomas Pomeroy had abandoned the family without a word. Whether fleeing from guilt, fear, or resentment, his disappearance left Ruth Ann alone to deal with Jesse's spiraling depravity. In August 1872, she moved the family to a modest apartment on Broadway Street in South Boston, telling neighbors she had found better work. But evil doesn't vanish with geography. Instead of stopping Jesse, the move emboldened him. He now understood his mother would protect him, would help him escape consequences. He also realized that in South Boston, he had a new hunting ground, fresh victims, and no reputation to precede him. The escalation was swift and horrifying. On August 17th, just 2 weeks after the move, fishermen discovered 7-year-old George Pratt on the beaches of South Boston. He had been tortured with unprecedented cruelty. Jesse had beaten him with driftwood-bitten chunks of flesh from his face and backside and used his fingernails to scratch deep gouges into the boy's skin. Pins and needles had been stabbed into George's body with sickening precision. Unlike the more calculated and distant assaults in Chelsea, this was personal, primal. Jesse was using his own body as a weapon, fully immersing himself in the suffering he caused. Local authorities, unaware of the Chelsea attacks, failed to recognize the pattern. Jurisdictional boundaries and a lack of communication between police departments in the 1870s gave Jesse the freedom to continue his spree without detection. And he did, refining his methods with every attack. Each new victim suffered more than the last. Each assault pushed the boundaries of cruelty further. And Jesse, protected by a mother who refused to see the truth and empowered by a society not yet ready to believe a child could be a monster, had no reason to stop. On September 11, 1872, Jesse Pomeroy lured 7-year-old Joseph Kennedy away from his family's tenement to a vacant boathouse hidden deep within the South Boston salt marshes. He had stalked Joseph for days, memorizing his routine and pinpointing when the boy made solo trips to the corner store. The location was meticulously chosen, far more secluded than the Powderhorn Hill outhouse, surrounded by thick marsh grass and shielded by the landscape itself. Jesse had prepped the scene in advance, bringing along knives, rope, and other tools of torment. Inside that forgotten boathouse, Jesse unleashed a new level of violence. He slashed Joseph's face repeatedly with a stolen pocket knife, leaving wounds meant to scar him forever. Then he forced the boy's head underwater again and again, stopping just before drowning each act of near-death torture, intensifying Jesse's growing obsession with absolute control. Drowning, Jesse discovered, wasn't just a method of physical torture, it was a psychological weapon, one that produced ultimate fear and helplessness. 6 days later, on September 17th, 5-year-old Robert Gould was found tied to a telegraph pole along the Hartford and Erie rail line, slashed and beaten, his throat nearly cut. Jesse had only fled because footsteps nearby startled him. It was the closest he had come to killing, and only blind luck had spared Robert's life. This near murder revealed Jesse's homicidal intent more clearly than ever before, but it also marked his first major mistake. Robert, though traumatized, gave police a detailed and accurate description of his attacker, including one feature impossible to forget: a marble white eye. For the first time, investigators had a concrete lead, a distinctive trait that could not be mistaken. Police launched a search across South Boston for a boy matching the description. But in the densely packed working-class neighborhoods, especially among Irish immigrant communities, wary of law enforcement cooperation was scarce. Jesse, meanwhile, grew more confident and reckless. Shielded by his mother's protection and emboldened by his growing sense of invincibility, he began staying longer with his victims, leaving behind more evidence and taking greater risks. Then, on September 20th, Jesse made a fatal misstep. While passing South Boston's Police Station 6 during one of his scouting walks, he stopped to look inside, curiosity drawing him to the window. What he saw should have sent him fleeing 7-year-old Joseph Kennedy, sitting with police describing in vivid detail the horrors he endured. But Jesse lingered, fascinated by the sight of his former victim. When Joseph spotted the unmistakable white eye staring at him from the window, he erupted in screams. "That's him. That's the boy who hurt me. That's the marble eye," he cried, shaking with terror. Officers stormed out of the station and arrested 13-year-old Jesse Pomeroy on the spot. When confronted, Jesse didn't deny anything. He calmly confessed to being the boy torturer, showing no emotion, no remorse, no understanding of the gravity of his crimes. One by one, surviving victims were brought in, and each pointed to him with unshakable certainty. The authorities finally saw the full picture. The same predator had terrorized children across both Chelsea and South Boston. But he wasn't a grown man, as they had assumed. He was a child. The next day, on September 21st, Jesse appeared before juvenile court judge William G. Forsyth. The courtroom was packed with horrified parents and reporters from every major Boston paper. Jesse stood before the judge with chilling composure, methodically detailing his crimes in a monotone voice devoid of feeling. His calm, emotionless recounting of the torture stunned the court and extinguished any illusion that this was a boy simply in need of discipline. Judge Forsyth, confronted with an unprecedented case, sentenced Jesse to 6 years in the state reform school for boys in Westboro, the maximum punishment allowed for a juvenile. The city exhaled in relief. The boy torturer was finally behind bars. But that sense of safety was tragically premature. The state's response to Jesse's crimes was based on a flawed assumption that he was a broken child who could be healed with structure and education. No one realized they were locking away a predator whose sadism ran deeper than trauma. Westboro's reform school aimed to rehabilitate young offenders through religious guidance, manual labor, and moral instruction. The institution was built on optimism, the belief that no child was beyond redemption. Jesse knew this, and he played his role flawlessly. He was obedient in class, respectful during sermons, cooperative with staff. He studied, volunteered for extra duties, and displayed a carefully constructed persona of remorse and eagerness to improve. Staff praised his intelligence and self-discipline, but it was all a performance. Jesse wasn't learning empathy, he was learning how to manipulate the system. The boy torturer wasn't being cured. He was biding his time, preparing for the day when he would be free to hunt again. Jesse Pomeroy had mastered the art of deception. At Westboro, he learned how to say the right things, wear the right expressions, and project the image of a boy reformed, while all the while harboring the same violent urges that had once terrorized 2 cities. His time in the reform school didn't cure him. It taught him how to play a role. Ruth Ann Pomeroy, meanwhile, was relentless in her efforts to bring her son home, visiting him regularly and portraying herself as a devoted mother of a misunderstood boy. She lobbied tirelessly for Jesse's early release. She claimed he had been led astray by bad influences, not by any innate malice, and argued that his transformation was real. Institutional staff, already predisposed to believe in rehabilitation, saw Jesse's good behavior and intelligence as proof their system worked. He attended classes, participated in religious services, and displayed impeccable manners, all part of a calculated performance designed to fool those in charge. Ruth Ann's persistence, combined with Jesse's convincing act, paid off. In February 1874, after serving just 17 months of his 6-year sentence, Jesse was released into his mother's custody at the age of 14. Officials believed he had been reformed and no longer posed a threat. During his time away, Ruth Ann had opened a modest dressmaking shop at 327 Broadway Street. Jesse began working behind the counter while his brother Charles ran a nearby newspaper stand. To outsiders, the Pomeroys appeared to be a quiet, hard-working family trying to rebuild their lives. What no one realized was that a predator had returned to their midst unannounced, unmonitored, and more dangerous than ever. Jesse's dark impulses hadn't faded. They had intensified during his months of enforced restraint. He emerged not reformed, but better at hiding who he truly was. He knew how to manipulate, how to delay suspicion, and how to control himself just enough to kill when the opportunity was perfect. Barely a month after his release, he made his move. On March 18, 1874, 10-year-old Katie Curran left her family's tenement with a few coins in her pocket, excited to finally buy a school notebook she had long been saving for. Bright, friendly, and beloved by all who knew her, Katie represented everything Jesse was not hopeful, innocent, and unfilled with promise. Her errand brought her past the Pomeroy dress shop where she had been before with her mother. That morning, Jesse was alone behind the counter. His mother was busy in the back, and Katie, recognizing the shop, entered in search of school supplies. What happened inside the shop remains unclear. Jesse never revealed the full truth. But what's certain is that Katie never made it to her next stop. She never returned home. Somewhere inside the dress shop, Jesse acted on the urges that had been building since his release. He killed her, how exactly remains unknown, but based on his prior behavior, her final moments were likely marked by terror, pain, and the realization that no help was coming. With chilling efficiency, Jesse carried her small body to the basement and buried her in an ash heap, discarded like refuse, among the remains of the building's winter coal fires. As the day wore on and Katie failed to return, her family launched a frantic search. The tight-knit Irish immigrant community joined them, combing every alley, every basement, every abandoned space. They lit lanterns and knocked on doors, hoping desperately for a miracle. Police began their own methodical investigation, retracing Katie's steps and visiting every shop she might have entered. But Jesse was calm, composed. No one suspected the quiet boy behind the counter. The monster had killed again, and this time he'd made sure there would be no witnesses. When police reached Ruth Ann Pomeroy's modest dress shop, both she and Jesse were questioned about Katie Curran's disappearance. Jesse responded with practiced calm, explaining that Katie had indeed visited the store that day, purchased a few sewing items, and left shortly afterward. He described her demeanor and behavior with such detail and apparent concern that officers found him credible. Ruth Ann backed her son's account without hesitation, claiming she had seen Katie come and go safely while she worked in the back room. When the police requested to search the premises, both mother and son agreed without resistance. The search, though thorough by the standards of the time, focused on finding a missing child, not a concealed body. Officers inspected the main shop floor, the workroom, and even entered the basement. But they failed to investigate the ash heap where Jesse had buried Katie's remains. To them it appeared as nothing more than household soot and debris. Jesse, meanwhile, played the role of concerned bystander to perfection, even suggesting places the police might check and expressing hope for Katie's safe return. No suspicion fell on him. The truth was horrifying. Her body lay just feet away, decomposing beneath the boots of the very men searching for her. This successful cover-up gave Jesse a dangerous new level of confidence. He had killed, buried the evidence, lied to the police, and walked away without consequences. In his twisted logic, this meant he was unstoppable, smarter than the authorities, untouchable in his mother's care, and free to do it again. And he would. 5 weeks after Katie's disappearance, Jesse's thirst for violence returned with renewed intensity. The murder had awakened something darker within him, something that craved not just domination, but prolonged, exquisite cruelty. Katie's death had been rushed. This time, Jesse wanted to savor it. On April 22, 1874, in the warmth of a spring afternoon, 4-year-old Horace Milan played near his family's cramped South Boston tenement. Horace was a sweet, golden-haired boy with bright blue eyes and a gentle spirit. His parents, John and Leonora, were poor but loving immigrants who cherished their son above all else. When Jesse approached Horace, the child felt no fear. Jesse used a soft voice, offered candy, and promised something special, something only good boys got to see. Witnesses would later recall seeing the little boy walking hand in hand with Jesse, smiling, unaware that he was being led to his death. Jesse took Horace through the winding streets to the desolate marshes near Dorchester Bay, an isolated strip of land where city noise gave way to tall grass and salt air. He had scouted the area in advance, ensuring no one would hear screams or stumble across his ritual. The journey took nearly an hour. Horace chatted happily the entire way, trusting his older companion completely. When they reached the secluded location, Jesse's mask slipped. The predator was no longer pretending. He began by stripping Horace naked, robbing him of all security and marking the start of a systematic hours-long torture session. With a knife brought for the occasion, Jesse carved X-shaped wounds across the boy's body, precise incisions meant to prolong agony without causing death. He watched every reaction, every scream, every tear with fascination, as if studying the mechanics of pain. Then, in a final act of monstrous violence, Jesse slit Horace's throat from ear to ear with such force that he nearly decapitated him. But his rage didn't end with death. Jesse mutilated the child's body, gouging out an eye and mutilating the genitals, not for concealment, but to fulfill a deep-seated need for total domination. The level of brutality was so extreme that even hardened detectives, once they discovered the body, would later describe the crime as almost inhuman in its savagery. Jesse Pomeroy had crossed the final threshold. He was no longer just a violent boy with dark impulses. He was now a fully realized killer, one who found pleasure in pain, power in death, and validation in evading justice. What happened next would expose not only the true depths of Jesse's depravity, but the tragic failures of a system that had given him a second chance at the cost of innocent lives. In the final act of desecration, Jesse Pomeroy set fire to the mutilated body of Horace Milan, scorching the small corpse in a grotesque attempt to destroy evidence. But the fire served a symbolic purpose too. It was a literal incineration of innocence, a final insult to the child whose life he had taken in such monstrous fashion. Later that same afternoon at 3, 8:45 p.m., brothers George and James Power were combing the beach for clams when they stumbled upon a shallow pit near the water's edge. What they found was beyond comprehension: the charred, butchered remains of little Horace. Both men became physically ill at the sight. The mutilation was so horrific, the intent so clearly sadistic, that even hardened investigators struggled to understand how such savagery could come from any human being, let alone a boy. The child had not simply been murdered. He had been tortured, violated, and defiled in ways that spoke to a deep, unrelenting evil. As word spread through South Boston, crowds gathered at the scene. Several residents fainted on the spot, and others required medical care for shock. Horror gripped the community with a new level of urgency. Given Jesse Pomeroy's record and the disturbing pattern of escalation, suspicion quickly turned toward him. But suspicion alone wouldn't be enough. The police needed physical proof. That night at 10 p.m., officers executed a search warrant at the Pomeroy home. They found Jesse with fresh defensive scratches on his arms, clear signs of a struggle. His clothing was stained with blood, and most damning of all, the tread pattern on his boots matched the prints left near Horace's body. The evidence was overwhelming. Jesse was arrested on the spot. At Charles Street Jail, Jesse initially claimed ignorance. He sat calmly in his cell as investigators built their case, collecting blood samples, matching physical injuries, and compiling a timeline. But what broke the facade wasn't the evidence, it was the confrontation. Detectives brought Jesse to the morgue, where Horace Milan's desecrated body lay on a cold steel table. They pulled back the sheet. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the most stoic officers recoiled at the sight. But Jesse showed nothing. No flinch, no reaction, no remorse. When asked if he had committed the murder, his reply came in a flat, affectless voice. "I suppose I did." The sheer detachment in those 4 words sent chills through everyone present. But Jesse wasn't finished. In a moment that would become infamous in American criminal history, Jesse Pomeroy went on to claim responsibility for the murders of 27 other children. At first, police assumed he was lying or trying to inflate his notoriety. But as Jesse described specific details of missing children and unsolved cases, some never made public investigators realized at least some of his claims might be true. He wasn't just boasting, he was confessing, and the implications were terrifying. The first priority was verification. Acting on Jesse's confession, police returned to Ruth Ann Pomeroy's dress shop this time, with a team of diggers and a clear understanding of what Jesse was capable of hiding. On July 18, 1874, after hours of searching, they found what they had missed. Months earlier, the decomposed body of Katie Curran, buried in the basement ash heap, right where Jesse had left her. The discovery was confirmation of everything. Jesse had killed Katie, worked above her body for months, and smiled at customers while lying to police. There was no denying it now. With 2 recovered bodies, blood evidence, a confession, and multiple forensic matches, Jesse's fate was sealed. Ruth Ann's efforts to protect her son had collapsed entirely. Her denial had enabled a murderer to walk free and kill again. The public demanded justice, and the state responded. Jesse Pomeroy was indicted for the murders of Katie Curran and Horace Milan. And though he was only 15 years old, he would stand trial as an adult, the youngest defendant in Massachusetts history, to face first-degree murder charges in adult court. On December 9th and 10th, 1874, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court in Suffolk County became the center of national attention. Crowds packed the courtroom. Spectators stood in the aisles. Reporters from across the country sent daily updates on the unprecedented proceedings. Jesse sat quietly throughout, unshaken, that haunting marble eye scanning the courtroom. He displayed no emotion, no regret, no fear. To the people gathered in that courtroom, And to the stunned readers across the nation, Jesse Pomeroy represented something terrifying, the embodiment of evil in the form of a child. He had defied everything society believed about innocence reform and the capacity for human cruelty. The trial wasn't just about justice. It was about confronting a chilling truth. Sometimes the monster doesn't come in the form of a stranger. Sometimes it comes with a child's face. As Jesse Pomeroy stood trial in December 1874, the contrast between his appearance and his crimes unsettled even the most hardened observers. Though he had grown taller during his 15 months in jail, his face still held the soft features of adolescence. That childlike innocence resting atop a soul capable of the most monstrous violence made the proceedings all the more disturbing. The prosecution, led by the Attorney General of Massachusetts, faced a grim but straightforward task. The evidence of Jesse's guilt was overwhelming. Witnesses detailed a timeline of escalating brutality from his early assaults in Chelsea to the horrific murders in South Boston. Survivors of Jesse's torture took the stand, older now, but forever marked by the pain he had inflicted. They recalled in excruciating detail the deception, the bindings, the cold eyes watching as they begged for mercy. Then came the physical evidence, blood on Jesse's clothing, that matched Horace Milan's blood-type footprint impressions, matching Jesse's boots and the fresh defensive wounds on Jesse's body. All of it confirmed with forensic clarity. But the most damning element was Jesse's own confession. Delivered with the same eerie emotional flatness that had come to define him, he told investigators he didn't know why he had killed, only that something had made him do it. It was a vague, chilling explanation that offered no closure, only a deeper sense of unease. The courtroom, crowded with reporters and onlookers, sat stunned. Jesse's defense attorney, Charles Robinson, faced an impossible task. With a client who had confessed to unthinkable acts, Robinson could only hope to sway the jury with pleas for mercy. He argued that Jesse's youth history of abuse and potential mental illness made him less culpable. Expert witnesses spoke of trauma psychopathy and legal insanity. They cited Jesse's upbringing, his beatings, his social isolation. But the jury wasn't convinced. Jesse's actions weren't chaotic, they were calculated. He planned his attacks, scouted his victims, avoided detection, and covered his tracks. This wasn't the madness of impulse. It was the cruelty of control. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning a verdict guilty of first-degree murder. But in recognition of his youth, they appended a formal recommendation for mercy. Judge Horace Gray delivered the sentence required by law, death by hanging. Jesse Pomeroy, at just 15 years old, became the youngest person ever sentenced to death in the history of Massachusetts. The sentence sent shockwaves through the legal world. Could a civilized society execute a child no matter how heinous his crime? Governor William Gaston didn't think so. Deeply religious and morally principled, he refused to sign the death warrant. 3 times the governor's council voted on Jesse's fate. 3 times Gaston declined to act, citing his refusal to authorize the execution of a child. The result was an unprecedented legal limbo. Jesse remained on death row for nearly 2 years, while legal experts, clergy, and politicians debated his fate. Some saw clemency as moral weakness. Others viewed it as a stand for humanity in the face of monstrous evil. Finally, in August 1876, an anonymous council vote tipped the scales. Jesse Pomeroy's sentence was commuted to life in prison in solitary confinement. On September 7, 1876, just shy of his 17th birthday, Jesse was transferred to the Massachusetts State Prison in Charlestown, the same neighborhood where he had been born. There, in a 6 by 8 foot concrete cell, he would remain for the next 4 decades. His punishment was total absolute isolation, no visitors, no human contact beyond routine checks. The cell was sparse, a cot, a waste bucket, and a small shelf for personal items. But even locked in a box, Jesse's mind remained active and dangerous. Over the years, he became notorious for his ingenuity, making more than a dozen escape attempts. He crafted tools from bits of metal turned pens into drills and filed down spoons into lockpicks. Time and again, wardens uncovered hidden rope, improvised chisels, and sharpened objects carefully concealed in crevices of his cell or hidden on his person. Despite the walls, the isolation, and the decades slipping by, Jesse Pomeroy never changed. He remained the boy torturer in spirit, his violent impulses undimmed. The prison system had managed to contain him, but never reform him. He would die as he had lived a monster in human form, his marble-white eyes staring blankly at a world that never understood how something so young could be capable of such enduring evil. Jesse Pomeroy's legend behind prison walls was forged not just through the savagery of his crimes, but through his uncanny resourcefulness and unyielding will to escape even in total isolation. One of his most infamous attempts nearly killed him. In a last-ditch effort to break free, Jesse tampered with a gas pipe that fueled the prison's lighting system, hoping to blast his way through the concrete wall. The explosion failed, but it left him permanently blind, costing him his one remaining eye. Even this catastrophic injury didn't stop him. Jesse simply adapted, honing his memory and other senses to navigate the prison and plan further escape attempts. Though physically trapped, his mind remained active and alarmingly sharp. Over the decades, Jesse taught himself to read and write in Hebrew, German, and French, using books provided by prison chaplains. He wrote poetry, some hauntingly lyrical, others deeply disturbing, exploring themes of isolation, vengeance, and evil. He even fought legal battles to publish his work, claiming artistic expression was a right no inmate should be denied. More astonishingly, Jesse became a self-taught legal scholar. Drawing from law books in the prison library, he filed appeals parole applications and petitions for clemency that were so well written they impressed judges and lawyers alike. His arguments were logically sound, technically precise, and fiercely persistent. But beneath the polish, his writings betrayed a disturbing truth. Jesse never accepted responsibility. He never acknowledged the trauma he had caused, never expressed true remorse, and never stopped painting himself as the victim. Psychiatrists who evaluated him over the years noted the same chilling traits: above-average intelligence, a complete absence of empathy, and an unwavering belief that he had been wronged. Jesse simply could not or would not see his crimes through the eyes of his victims or their families. After 40 years of solitary confinement, in 1917, the state relented. At 58, Jesse was transferred to the general prison population. The move was driven partly by his age and partly by growing concerns that such extreme isolation constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Jesse struggled at first with the shock of social interaction, but slowly adjusted. He participated in prison programs, joined theatrical performances, and struck up friendships with other long-term inmates, many of whom respected his intelligence and legal acumen. But those who knew his past kept their distance. They understood that the man who had tortured and killed children was still there, lurking behind a more polished mask. Throughout it all, Jesse remained emotionally detached from his crimes. He never apologized, never expressed sympathy, and never viewed himself as anything other than a misunderstood genius wrongfully caged. In 1929, with his health failing, Jesse was transferred to Bridgewater Hospital for the criminally insane. He was 70, blind and frail, but his mind remained active. He continued to write poetry and exchange letters with the few correspondents still intrigued by his case. Medical staff, aware of his history, treated him with professional care, but never forgot who he was. On September 29, 1932, Jesse Pomeroy died in his sleep at the age of 72. He had spent 58 years in prison, longer than any inmate in American history at the time. There was no funeral, no family, no grave marker. He was buried in an unmarked prison cemetery, his death mentioned only briefly in local papers. The boy who had once terrified a city died alone and largely forgotten. But Jesse's story didn't end with his death. His case left a permanent mark on American legal history. It established a precedent for trying juveniles as adults. It forced courts and lawmakers to grapple with questions that remain unresolved to this day. What makes a child capable of evil? Can the most damaged individuals ever be rehabilitated? And how should a just society respond when a child commits acts that defy human comprehension? Jesse's life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the darker corners of human nature. Was he a product of relentless abuse and neglect? Or was he born broken, a vessel for evil? From the start, was his lifelong imprisonment justice, or a failure to confront the deeper causes of his crimes? Whatever your conclusion, the legacy of Jesse Pomeroy remains one of the most haunting in American criminal history. A child who forced the world to ask whether innocence can be lost, or if in rare and terrifying cases it never existed at all. I'm always on him. What do you think? Was Jesse born evil or shaped by the cruelty he endured? Was justice served by locking him away for life, or was there another path society should have taken? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you want more true horror stories that explore the darkest sides of the human psyche, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves mysteries that linger long after the credits roll. See you in the next one. See you.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.